Welcome to Alabama Gristmill. This is another episode we've got featuring stories of Alabama that you might not have heard in history class. And I want to welcome the co-host. I'm Mike Causey, my co-host Donna Causey.
Hi,
welcome.
Glad to be here today and talk a little bit more about history.
For those that, we've got the podcast going as well, but all these stories we're talking about, you can find a lot of them in our series of history books that cover the not as well-known stories of Alabama. And that series is called Alabama Footprints. And you can find that series on, Amazon.com is the primary location. You can find all that, and it's both ebook and paperback format. And then you also find the stories as well on our website, alabamapioneers.com. So we've got a first, a story about a first today, and it's you go ahead and tell us a little bit.
Alabama has a lot of firsts. This is another one of those stories that I ran into while I was browsing through some old newspapers, and you just run across one once in a while, and it just piques your interest. You don't realize how many firsts Alabama really has, and this is kind of interesting because you don't realize the name of the city in this one from the very beginning.
Let's see if we can figure it out.
See if you figure it out as you go along.
Well, I mean, some listeners out there are able to, they might know this, but if not, stay tuned to hear the rest of the story.
It's all about electricity and that.
Well, I'll let you go ahead and get into the story now. So tell us a little bit about this wonderful first in the state of Alabama.
This is the story of how a small town named Woodstock also became a large city, and it was one of the first to try electricity in the state of Alabama. This city, to give you a few clues, is located in the slope of the Blue Ridge Mountains, just northeast of Birmingham. It was founded with the name of Woodstock. Some of the early settlers were the Nobles and the Tylers. General Daniel Tyler, who is one of the first buried in the city, was the grandfather of Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt. Her maiden name at that time was Edith Carew. Samuel Noble was a pioneer of the iron industry in the South. He was born in 1834, and he came to America when he was only 3 and settled with his family in Reading, Pennsylvania. His father, James Noble Sr., in 1851, decided to visit his native country of England, and he happened to attend the Crystal Palace Exposition in London while he was there, and he happened to see some hematite ore that came from the southeast United States that was better than any he found in Reading, Pennsylvania. So in 1855, he decided that he would move his family to Rome, Georgia, and he built one of the largest iron-producing companies south of Richmond. Noble's enterprises and furnace produced weaponry for the Confederacy until it was captured and destroyed by federal troops in 1864. Of course, it was a threat since they were building this weaponry. They rebuilt the foundries after the war, and in 1871, they started looking around in the area of Alabama to expand their production. According to his daughter, Mrs. Cato Roberts, she said that during the war, he and a friend, Bishop Quintard, were trying to keep ahead of a Yankee raiding party on their way to Rome, Georgia, where the foundry was. And so they happened to go through Alabama and the northeast part, and they came upon the ruins of an old Oxford furnace in Alabama, which had been burned by the Federals at a little earlier date. His daughter stated that as he gazed over the peaceful valley, he said, "This is where I shall build my city." The Noble family rebuilt their foundries after the war in Rome, Georgia, and started really deciding, they wanted to expand because they were doing so well. And they started looking in Alabama to expand their production. So Samuel was sent over to acquire the property. In the process, he visited Charleston sometime in there, and he met General Daniel Tyler. General Tyler was also interested in the iron properties, and they formed a partnership. And so Samuel Noble and Daniel Tyler decided to buy the ruins of the Oxford furnace and rebuilt it. The Woodstock Iron Company was organized, but they still had much to do. Only 3 farmhouses were on the property. They didn't have anything else there but just woods and dense forests, so they had to build from the ground up. After they got it built, they needed workmen, and not having a whole lot of people trained in the field of iron making around, they went to England to seek out their workers. So workmen and carpenters and stonemasons and those that knew how to roast the ore, all the ores, the charcoal burners came from Sweden, and they brought them all over. But of course, they couldn't just live in tents. They had to have some housing. So they built houses for them and stayed busy with that. They built a large brick store and other buildings. By 1873, the first Woodstock furnace went into blast, and they were in production. A company town soon began to spring up around the area, and it was really looking wonderful until a financial crisis set in. And all of a sudden, iron fell from $40 to $18 a ton. And everybody said, oh, you're doomed. This little company's just not going to make it and survive this. And so they began to worry a lot that all these people were going to be without employment and didn't know what they were going to do. But Samuel Noble, who was head of it at the time, he was mainly the one that knew about the iron due to his own father's experience and his experience with a Rome, Georgia foundry. Samuel saw the impending crisis, and he shipped by express several parcels of iron to different points in the north. Then he went to Springfield, Massachusetts as the first stop, and he immediately went to the government armory. He figured he might do well with the U.S. government since everything else was crashing. He carried a piece of charcoal pig iron under his arm, and he laid it down in front of the person in charge and said, I am on one of the craft. I'm working iron now, and I want you to try this sample. So the man decided, well, I'll do it. It won't hurt anything. He's right here. So when it came to the white, he put it under the white heat. He put it under the steam hammer and crushed it into form and welded it and hammered it. And after a lot of inspection in his own foundry, he said, this is the best iron I ever handled. Where is it made? And okay, of course, Mr. Noble immediately jumped in and said, my friend, I wish to make a customer of this armory. Will you help? And so the man called his superintendent, and he inspected the iron as well. And, of course, they got a new customer that way. And all the other places up north that he sent the iron and the samples, he went along and did the same thing. And he just didn't know failure. He kept on pushing and coming up with different schemes. And while the Depression was gripping the country, the Woodstock Iron Company just kept hanging on. A lot of it was for his employees' sake, because he had brought them over from England and other countries, and he didn't want to leave them stranded just because the economy decreased. And the iron continued to pile up in the yard, though, despite whatever he did. So he knew he had to pay his employees, so he came up with another scheme. He borrowed against the piled up iron in the yard at 12%, and then he issued scrip to the employee and was accepted through the surrounding county at its face value. As a result of all that he did and his many schemes, it was one of the few Southern industries that survived the financial panic of 1873. And now, I've been calling this Woodstock all along. Have you guessed the name of the city yet? Well, like I said, it was initially named Woodstock, but it was discovered that there was another town in Alabama named Woodstock. So when it was growing pretty rapidly, the post office was established there, and it said this town had to be renamed because 2 Woodstocks just were not working in Alabama. So the town was renamed Anniston when it was incorporated in 1873. It was named Anniston after Annie Scott Tyler, the daughter-in-law of General Daniel Tyler. It was shortened from the words Annie's Town. The land on which the town of Anniston now stands was actually sold to D.P. Gunnels, who later sold it to the Oxford Furnace Company in 1862, which originally started the Woodstock boundary. Samuel Noble was an enterprising man with his town. He laid out broad streets, he conserved the parks, he provided sewage and waterworks, and was aware of the lack of trees in Europe, so he decided to plant an avenue of water oaks, and some of them still remain today. He planted back in 1881. He was always willing to try new things, so that's why his town of Anniston became one of the first places to use electricity in Alabama. In 1881, he bought the Alabama furnace at Jennifer, expanding his investments in the state, and he abolished convict labor, which was going on at the time, and formed a company of which he was the president. Later, the Clifton Iron Furnaces in Ironton was built by him, and under the management of Mr. Stephen Noble, and it paid the dividends for many years. The Anniston Inn was one of the earliest of its kind. It was well known all over the country, and it was a product of his foresight. And the halls were entertained by men of many states, and it was a popular resort for the youth. It was destroyed by fire in 1923. You know, we talk about electricity. It's amazing that people were reluctant to use it back then. So it was a big deal when Samuel Noble decided to put it in his factory. It was considered just a novelty and something that would go away, and, you know, nobody's going to be really interested, because there's a lot of inventions going on at the time. You can look back in the newspaper during that time and you see how Alabama Power was really trying to entice customers into putting in the electrical system in their municipalities and in their homes. The Woodstock Iron Company tested it and declared it a success in 1882, which is very, very early. The Selma Times said it kind of quoted what happened when it first was used in the iron company. They said that when the light first appeared, it seemed to be struggling hopelessly with the darkness. It continued to increase as more steam was put upon the engine, until a broad, beautiful stream of light flooded the surrounding space with a soft, mellow radiance covering a radius of more than 400 yards. And this was amazing for them because, you know, they had candle and gas lights and all, which wouldn't cover that much area of light. Due to his willingness to try using electricity in his foundry, I'm sure that's why in 1913, Anniston Electric and Gas Company became one of the first municipal customers to purchase electricity from Alabama Power. Another thing about Anniston that people may not know is that it was also called the Brooklyn of the South, or the City of Churches. Had nicknames, both nicknames. In 1883, the company town, which had grown to a manufacturing city, was opened to the public, and the Calhoun County seat was moved to Anniston in 1895. The city was nicknamed the City of Churches because it had such a large number of churches, from Episcopalian, Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian, sometimes 2 and 3 of each and every religion there. So they were very involved in religious life in Anniston. Sadly, on August 10th, 1888, Samuel Noble died. It was said he was occupied in arranging an exhibit for the freight car Alabama on Wheels, which was going around the country. And he was left alone in the car, and he didn't realize it was being moved to Oxford, 3.5 miles away. And instead of waiting for his carriage to get him and take him back to Anniston, he walked back. But it happened to be a very hot noonday sun shining outside, and so he stopped at a drugstore and he drank a glass of iced milk. He ate a hearty dinner, and afternoon he was seized with an attack of acute indigestion, which they say caused heart failure. And on the 13th of August, he passed away, a martyr to his zeal for the city he had founded and dreamed about. And, of course, telegrams came from all over the country because he was such a well-known and well-liked individual. But that's the story of how Woodstock became the City of Anniston.
Well, that's pretty amazing. I actually did not know that was one of the first towns of electricity in the state of Alabama was Anniston.
Yeah, you don't know it, and it was one person's dream that it happened that way. So he was really innovative in trying to get new things into Alabama at that time. There were a lot of famous people, and there were good, wonderful pioneers that we don't know anything about. But Anniston does remember Mr. Nobles.
And we'll be covering, keep on listening to the podcast, subscribe to it, tell your friends about it, because we're going to be covering more first and more fascinating individuals in the history of Alabama. Another first state, Alabama, is we were the first state to celebrate Christmas.
Oh,
I believe.
Yeah. There were a lot of firsts. Veterans Day, too. And, there were a lot of things that you don't know, that people don't realize, that we'll get into down the line. And other future stories,
Yes, absolutely. So stay tuned to the next episode of Alabama and Gristmill, and we'll let Red Foley go ahead and play us out, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Joe dancing round on his toes, throws away his crutch and hollers, hey, let her go, oh honey.